Hi, and welcome to this video on teaching and learning approaches and methods in education and training. This topic is covered in a variety of education and training courses. In fact, all three of the Level 3 Award, Level 4 Certificate, and the Level 5 Diploma in Education and Training. You would just be expected to go to different levels of analysis depending on your course. However, the approaches and the methods would stay the same. So to begin with, we're just going to look at general approaches to teaching and learning. As you can see, one is andragogical, one is pedagogical. So what do you think that it means? Pedagogical is usually the word that is used for more traditional classroom-based delivery, which can end up being quite teacher-centered. And andragogical is the newer, more modern approach towards education, where the emphasis is on making teaching and learning student-centered. Now, depending on the region or your own educational background, or your own personal experiences, or even your personality type or learner type, you may actually have a preference for one or either of these. And as a trainer or educator or assessor, whatever you're qualifying as, it is really important to realize that you don't let your personal preference or approach or experience affect the training that you're delivering to your learners. Modern day learners do expect to have a lot more responsibility and control over their learning, which is why it is recommended to use the andragogical approach. So as you can see in this table, it's summarized that the pedagogical is teacher-centered, as I said, and andragogical is learner-centered. However, that does not mean that the teacher is passive in the andragogical. So even though the learner is passive, meaning that the teacher is usually doing most of the work, the planning, the delivery, the lecturing, and the actual student activity in your lesson planning in a pedagogical approach would be that the learners would simply be listening, and there would be very little student talk time, which is another term that we use in education training. And they would mostly be, for example, maybe taking notes or listening, perhaps giving answers to a couple of questions, but the general control and responsibility would be with the teacher. On the other hand, in andragogical, both are active, because in order to plan an effective lesson where students have responsibility and control of their learning and the teacher is a facilitator, you still actually have to be very active to ensure that you guide the learner along the learning pathway that you have designed. So for example, if it's an ESOL classroom and the learner is discovering the correct use of the continuous present tense, you would need to design the activities or worksheets, or the different methods that we're going to talk about in the following couple of slides. You really have to make sure that they follow the kind of path or the logic that you want them to, rather than ending up mixing it up with maybe the continuous past or the perfect present tense. So that's why there still is responsibility for the teacher, and the teacher is still active. However, the lesson is designed in a way where every activity is centered around the student being active, in a sense that they are maybe actively reflecting, actively doing, actively listening. So even when you design an activity and you require the students to listen, have you given them a task to do as they listen, to ensure that they are actively listening rather than probably dozing off or their mind wandering to something else while you lecture at the front of the classroom? So even though the activities might be the same, you really have to make sure that the student is active and that the tasks have been designed as such. That is the main important differentiating factor between andragogical and pedagogical. Specifically for millennials and the newer generations like Generation Z, it's also really important for the learners to have their own input. So in older models of pedagogical teaching. Basically, the teacher was in charge of the entire curriculum, and even deciding what tasks or projects were to be done. Whereas in the andragogical approach, it would be perfectly fine for the teacher to kind of open or introduce a topic and let the learners decide, which direction within that project, or split the projects or topics between learners who have interest in those particular areas, or even within a project to, for example, give different tasks to different types of learners. For example, certain learners might prefer to do the research, while certain learners may prefer to handle perhaps the technology side of the presentations and everything, whereas some learners might actually be more interested in going out and interviewing and gathering the data and so on. And in this way, the teacher is a facilitator and the learners are learning for themselves. And what you are actually doing is engaging them with intrinsic motivation. Now, at other points of this course, you probably have gone through, intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. So I'm not going to go into that here, but using the andragogical approach really, really makes sure that you are engaging your learners and you are kind of involving them and giving them that intrinsic motivation to learn and that engagement and interest, rather than them sitting through the classes just to make sure that they get that required percentage of attendance, or just so that they pass a test, which are all extrinsic motivational factors. So that's a rough overview of the general approaches in modern education. Now, obviously, as we go further into digitization and remote education, especially post-COVID, there are a variety of newer approaches. However, none of them are as tried and tested and generally accepted globally as the more student-centered versus the teacher-centered approaches. And generally, the newer approaches can be subsets of the newer learner-centered approaches. So that's why we focus on these two at this stage, and then it's up to you. If you do feel like you would like to learn more, you can go ahead and do your own research into further more detailed approaches. So now that we know our general approaches and that we know that we want to focus on learner-centered approaches rather than teacher-centered, how would we design our teaching methods? What activities would you actually put in your lesson plan? And even, some of these methods that we're going to cover may not actually be new. You may already have experience of using them, of going through them yourself as a learner or using them as an educator. But now entirely your aim and your emphasis should be on making sure that these tasks are designed in a way that they are focused on the student's activity rather than the teacher having all the control and the responsibility. So the most common one, and the one that where people usually get stuck the most, is giving a lecture, or that one-way kind of talking at the class. And you can call it whatever you like, but usually in larger university rooms where there are a couple of hundred students, even within the lifelong education in vocational training, where usually there are smaller groups, a lot of us can actually find us talking at the class without actually having a two-way discussion. And there is value to the learner in that if you can actually ask the right questions, and you can kind of engage the students, somehow maybe use visual aids or have a kind of demonstration going on at the same time. So basically, just a pure lecture on its own is probably very passive for the learner. However, it will appeal to auditory learners if you think back to your visual, audio, kinesthetic VAK learners. So it does appeal to auditory learners because they tend to absorb and remember information better when they hear it. But a learner would have to be really good at listening and note-taking to really get a benefit from this. Obviously, this is probably the easiest method for a teacher to implement, but obviously if we're looking at an andragogical student-centered method, we're not looking at how easy it is for us to deliver. Rather, we're looking at how more effective it would be for the learner to actually gain the knowledge. One value to the teacher, obviously an advantage of it, is that you can actually impart a lot of knowledge in a very short period of time. So it might not be bad in a sense. None of these methods are right or wrong or good or bad. The idea is that probably the best way to go about it is to use differentiation, which is use a variety of these methods so that where one fails, the other can complement it. So, for example, if you give a lecture followed by a practical activity, then that's perfectly fine. You are balancing out the pros and cons of both those methods. So the next, as follows, is a demonstration, simply because it usually goes along with the more practical skills alongside the lecture itself. However, now there's different ways of actually planning your demonstrations. I've seen people give demonstrations that are completely teacher-led, teacher-controlled, and in fact the students are still very passive. In order for a demonstration to be student-centered, you must do proper planning and preparation, and make sure that the students actually have an opportunity to get involved. Whichever senses, can they move around? Can they see, hear, smell, taste, touch? Whatever it is, can they actually do parts of the demonstration? If it's complex or high risk or dangerous, maybe they can do parts of it. Maybe it might be better to use a simulation than a real demonstration, or have some kind of even limited hands-on experience for them. Now, the benefit, obviously, on the other side is that it does link theory to practice. However, just be careful because it is very teacher-centered and can put off kinesthetic learners if they don't actually get a chance to do. Because a lot of teachers actually use demonstrations thinking, oh, this is an activity and will engage kinesthetic learners, but it won't really unless they are actually part of the demonstration. Next we have is group work, which is really an excellent way of having a student-centered activity. It caters usually to all kinesthetic, auditory, and visual learners. However, again, this depends on your design of the group work and the actual task at hand. It really helps people internalize knowledge because a lot of learners, whether they're kinesthetic, auditory, or visual, do actually benefit from having that discussion and from working together as a team. They learn better, they see other points of views, and they can actually get explanations or the opinions of their peers, which sometimes works better than a teacher talking at the students. Group work usually also gives you an opportunity to provide peer learning, peer assessment, peer support. Learners can get the opportunity to clarify and contribute and get involved. It gives them responsibility and control. Again, it has to be well designed, but usually it would be very difficult to make group work very didactic and teacher-centered. I mean, usually it is very student-centered. However, again, like we said, the teacher cannot be passive. The teacher must be active, must monitor progress, and keep the students focused on the activity, obviously. Sometimes in group work, it can take quite a long time for the students to actually arrive at the conclusion or the result or discover all the points that were required. So the teacher must plan according to that and have a plan B in place in case you start going over time. So we've also given a couple of examples, and the most popular one that I've seen is usually the snowball or the pyramid one. Or even the jigsaw one. And basically what they involve is, for example, if you have 10 students in the snowball or the pyramid type of activity, you could actually pair them off into 5 groups of 2 students, and then once they have 5-10 minutes to talk out the details, then they can join, perhaps rearrange the groups or make them slightly bigger groups of 5 and 5, and then have the whole class present their findings together as a group of 10. Or you could go from a group discussion in the classroom to smaller groups and then smaller groups. So it could be an inverted pyramid and you can go from smaller to bigger or bigger to smaller. A buzz is really great because you would have groups, and it works well with larger numbers where you have stations around the classroom. Some of the learners can be fixed or all of them can rotate, and basically the idea is that different groups are given different tasks surrounding an activity, and then certain learners can go from group to group and share their learning of what other groups are talking about or their opinions. And as they move from group to group, they also gather all the different opinions, but the different groups also gather from learning about what the other groups are doing. Again, if you search on the internet, there are different varieties and formats of doing this activity. So you can set it up for smaller groups of learners or larger groups of learners. And jigsaw group activities are very similar. Again, it's all about different ways of mixing groups and learners so that learners can learn from each other, and it minimizes the amount of teacher talk time that's required and the amount of time that the teacher has to explain different concepts to each student, and gives the responsibility and control of the learning to the students themselves. Discussion and debates are also really good methods, particularly if you're dealing with a controversial topic or a topic which has no right or wrong. Rather, you want the students to kind of explore further. So they could do that in a series of debates or discussions where they are free to kind of exchange their ideas and thrash out their different ideas and opinions. This is really valuable for learners to feel in control and empowered. It gives them confidence, and again, you can use peer support to kind of structure the activities in a way that stronger learners are grouped with maybe learners who need more support, or perhaps more confident learners are grouped with more shy learners, so that you can make sure that everyone does get involved. And again, depending on how the discussion or debate is structured, but usually they are quite auditory based, and would suit auditory learners. However, you can make them more suitable to kinesthetic learners by having some kind of movement and around, or making them very quick, and keeping it interesting and fun. Next, we have questioning. Now, questioning usually isn't a method which is used alone for a prolonged period of time unless it's an actual quiz or a test. However, questioning is, we deal with it here separately as a method, just simply because I think sometimes we miss out on the importance of questioning and the different types of questioning. So do your research and practice kind of open-ended versus closed questioning, nominated questioning. Develop your habit to ask leading questions. So instead of when a learner gives an answer or asks a question, rather than just simply giving the answer on a plate, learn to kind of ask questions in a series where you help the student to arrive at the conclusion or the correct answer themselves, and that can be very rewarding for learners, because it really enhances the feeling of them actually learning themselves and being in control of their learning. It challenges learners to think, although you probably want to balance the nominated questioning with learners who you would know would kind of be put on the spot or would go blank or kind of panic in that kind of a situation. And again, balancing the type of questions that you have and kind of using your leading questioning in a way that you break down the information in sizable chunks, which even the shyest of learners can manage. Also, you should encourage your students to constantly be actively note-taking while questioning, or even something like a lecture is happening. And it's really great because when you're questioning, obviously, especially verbally, you get instant responses. And what I normally do is try and have a couple of key conceptual, concept check questions. We call them CCQs at the beginning of every single topic when we're in a classroom, or even if we're live online in a remote setting. So I would do that even for a couple of seconds or a couple of minutes, depending on the amount of time, just to gauge the amount of prior knowledge and the students' readiness to learn, and to ensure that they have moved out from the previous topic mentally or finished up with the previous activity and now are zoned in to whatever we're going to start next. And it's very different in a self-paced environment, the way you're studying right now. But in a live environment, it's really important to kind of keep people on their toes and make sure that they're constantly engaged, because they won't be able to come back to that moment again. Whereas right now, even if the bell rings or the phone rings or you have to go somewhere, you can simply pause a video, or you can come back to it, or rewind something if you don't remember or understand what it says. You could even pause it and research it further in another window and come back. So the entire dynamic is quite different. So you do need to make sure that the questioning, whether it's written, whether it's online interactive, whether it's verbal, is built into your course at different points, and that you do get that feedback from learners, and that feedback is important for the learners themselves. So even within our courses, you can see sometimes there are interactive, very short knowledge check quizzes, and that feedback is important to you as well as a learner, because it reinforces the concepts that you have managed to learn and grasp and get the answers right. But at the same time, it's really important to get feedback on those questions, obviously, which were misunderstood or not answered correctly, so that that again reinforces learning in a different way. And it makes it really easy for you to kind of summarize or progress with your course, because you get a really great idea of where your learners actually are and how much learning is actually taking place. If you can kind of note the answers somewhere, or what I sometimes do is, if it's a longer course, or let's say, for example, we're doing the award in education and training over a period of a week, we could potentially have a small 10-minute, split the teams up, have quick, quizzes in the morning that revs everyone's energy and boosts everyone's kind of motivation. And I normally have a theme of different team groupings, but the morning quizzes will then be consistent teams, even though the teams may change later on during the day to avoid people becoming over competitive. So every morning is really great to kind of make sure that people are still remembering all of the work from the previous day. And you could even apply this on a weekly basis to, like weekly quizzes or whatever it is, depending on your kind of the length of your courses and your learners and the type of subject matter that you concentrate on. So finally, presentation is slightly different to a lecture, in the sense that with a presentation or a seminar, normally we would expect some kind of visual kind of aids. However, that is if it's a teacher-centered presentation and you're the one giving the presentation, which then overlaps with originally the lecture. However, in this sense, what we're actually talking about is for the students to have seminars and presentations among themselves. And all of a sudden, as you can see, it's the same activity, but the way it's designed, where the students are giving the presentations, giving feedback to their fellow students who have given the presentations. That means even when they're viewing the presentation, they have to be active, because they know they have to give feedback and ask questions at the end, rather than putting the control and the responsibility on the teacher to ask the questions or to mark or grade or question the students after the presentation, and so on. Similarly, seminars are a series of presentations where the students would have opportunities to network, ask direct questions, and perhaps even get on stage and be involved. So again, really it depends on how you structure this. And again, the teacher must be active, and some of these presentations can use the previous group activities that were mentioned, and has pretty much all the benefits that you would want from a student-centered activity if it is designed properly. A really underutilized method, in my experience, is simulation or kind of role play or scenario-based learning. We do use practicals in a sense of where we have, for example, in the construction industry or in the beauty industry, where you have practical skills, and obviously we would take, your typical kind of practical quite formally structured observations and have observation checklists and so on, whereas a simulation or role play or scenario-based learning is, I feel, more holistic and actually allows the learner to actually experience a wider range of possibilities within a scenario or a role play. So, for example, if you're doing a beauty practical on, for example, waxing or a procedure with nails, in a practical, the student would have a very formally set, rigid set of instructions which they would have to follow, and there would be, a corresponding checklist where the observer would say, okay, tick the boxes literally that the student has done this, skipped this step, or perhaps didn't do this really well, or should have focused on this area, and blah, blah, blah. However, in a simulation or a role play, you would actually set it up so that the procedure is the same. So perhaps they have to wax a customer or do a procedure for their nails or hair or whatever it is. But in a role play, one of their peers or you yourself or whoever could actually act as a customer. Now that means that not only are they carrying out the procedure, they actually have to satisfy the customer and answer their questions and go through, talk to them about the entire health and safety, let them know what they'll be doing next, perhaps talk them through the stages, even help them maybe decide what color nail polish would suit them best. And that kind of interaction and customer satisfaction would be missing from a typical kind of practical in that sense. So again, it really depends on how you actually design the activity, and this is more valuable when obviously the students are involved in the practice, and they can get input from the teacher as well as their peers. But also, it becomes more valuable if you can actually make it mirror a real-life workplace setting as much as possible. Now, in some industries, especially in manufacturing or construction, some procedures or scenarios may actually be incredibly high risk. So that's where simulation would really be used, where something is really high risk or very, very costly. So before giving a trainee or a learner access, for example, to, in engineering or in manufacturing to perhaps a very expensive machine, you would possibly have some kind of a digital simulation, or, any kind of a simulation where they would kind of do it at lower cost or lower risk before they actually try out the real thing. So again, that can be very valuable, especially if you're in a higher risk industry. The next is experiential or workplace learning. So obviously apprenticeships are the most obvious, method that comes to mind. And, the government is currently increasing funding behind apprenticeships. And employers seem to think that apprenticeships do result in the learners actually learning more valid and relevant workplace skills simply because they actually learn by doing. So once you're actually thrown into the job, once you're actually doing a real life kind of dealing with real life customers in real life workplaces and situations. So for example, if you're actually conducting an actual health and safety risk assessment, for example, for an office, rather than just talking about it or doing a case study or something like that, that would actually, in real life, many things can get thrown at you. There are a lot of unpredictable scenarios or, different variables that you can't always recreate in a scenario-based situation or in a role play. And then obviously getting that hands-on experience in work-based learning is incredibly valuable, which is why even in most of our courses, you are actually required to be working and to be able to actually learn all of this, but put it in to practice in a real life situation so that you can actually come back with a better understanding of the practical application of these, for example, even just these methods. Go back and apply them in your classroom, see what works with your learners. Something that works really well with certain learners in a certain specialist area would maybe not work with learners in another specialist area. So it really gives you a chance to try out everything that you're learning. And usually it suits all three VAK types. It's really good for all even the Honey Mumford learner types, regardless of the model of the learner types that you're using, it will normally, suit all different types of learners. And obviously, the learners are in control and have responsibility for their learning. Now, again, even if they're on the job or if they're apprentices or just like you would go and apply something to your workplace, it's incredibly important, obviously, for you to get observed while you're doing that and assessed, and to get that tutor feedback, to get that manager's feedback, or to get that peer feedback. And again, whether you're in the education and training qualifications or the assessor qualifications, you will actually have the opportunity to try these methods out and actually get assessed on how well you do them, as well as doing a self-evaluation where you can actually evaluate your own self and your own practice and your own experience of getting that done. Games and quizzes, I've mentioned them a couple of times. Usually these are quite informal, and they can test short-term or media-term knowledge. Again, it really depends on how you set this up. They can be very simple, straightforward, kind of true or false, multiple choice, fill in the blank type of questions, or they can be open-ended questions. But the idea behind games or quizzes is that they're quite quick and they're quite fun. So, just make sure that you develop that competitive spirit and, awaken that engagement and interest from your learners. But I mentioned previously in this video that you do have to kind of take steps to make sure that students don't get over competitive, or that if there is a learner who's consistently being paired with another learner or a group of learner where they don't maybe get along, or they don't get the opportunity to exercise their own personal skills or develop their personal skills, they may get demotivated, or especially if they feel like they're not being heard within that particular group, or getting along and so on. So that's why it is important, especially if you're on a longer duration course with your learners, it is quite important to actually keep switching around the teams. Again, you may have a different opinion of an experience of this depending on your learners and your subject, but that is definitely what we find on our education and training courses, where we might have similar activities with similar groups, but we do change the groups around using different types of activities. And the reward does matter. I would say regardless of the age of the learner, even if the reward is really small, it could be anything from an extra 5 minutes break time, or letting people off early that day, or, I don't know, if your company can provide it, it may actually even, I've seen just handing out ice creams on a hot day, or sponsoring a lunch, perhaps, if your company would allow it. Obviously, it's not ideal for the trainer to be paying for this kind of stuff out of your pocket. But again, if you can speak to your company and on your quiz days have some, kind of benefits. So if there's a canteen, maybe have free donuts or something. I don't know. But the idea is that even very small rewards like that do actually work, and they really matter to learners of all ages. So if you haven't ever tried that out, so possibly it's one to actually try out, and you will see that it really, really does engage learners, and it really brings that into that kind of fun element. Finally, we come to the last two methods. One is research and interview. So again, the idea is that researching or interviewing people doesn't really have to be very boring or didactic. So you can make this very interactive, very fun as well. Depending again how you set it up, if you actually even give students the time to actually go off and do this outside of the classroom, that's even better, because it suits all VAK type of learners and all Honey Mumford type of learners. However, just make sure that you do involve a variety of methods in the research, that students understand what qualitative and quantitative research is, especially if you're in a sector where there's a lot of research involved. Try and build in, experience and kind of group interaction in that research or discussion as well. And make sure that it's not 100% online. And if it is that, there is somebody, like for example, our tutors keep an eye on the kind of how valid and authentic the sources of the research are. So if you submit something which is potentially from a very spammy or unreliable site, then the tutor would possibly point that out and ask you to find an alternative source of information which you get from. So there are all these things where, again, a teacher does have to be active and be a facilitator, but it's very important for the teacher to promote independence in these activities, and again, make sure that you don't design them in a way that increases the reliance and control on behalf of you as the teacher or the trainer. Finally, case studies are also really underutilized as far as I've seen. There are certain subject areas which are very prone to using case studies. So especially kind of workplace skills and kind of leadership and business management type of courses would have a lot of case studies actually. Whereas in other kind of areas, even in education training, we don't see a lot of case studies, and you will see, especially if you're on the level 4, the level 5, where you are required to go much more in depth. We do put in the odd case study where you can actually see where people in a different country or a different demographic or a different, variable, how that kind of concept or approach would pan out with those in that scenario. Obviously, it promotes much higher level of understanding and problem solving, even critical thinking, because it's completely up to the learner to kind of come up with a solution. It's very, very open-ended. And again, depending on how you design it, it can be very learner-centered. And you do have to take care that you kind of take that step back, allow that group discussion to happen, allow the learners to go off on their own and have time to reflect. And give opportunity for all VAK learners to have their input and kind of engage with the case study and support each other. And you should be there to kind of guide them to make sure that they stay focused on the actual topic or the point that you want them to get out of it. So those are the different methods. Hopefully you found this video valuable in kind of maybe exploring new methods that you wouldn't have usually thought of, or even if it is an existing method that you use, perhaps you got insight into how to use that method differently. And especially, I hope that you've learned how to, kind of focus on making every single activity more student-centered, all the way from lectures to demonstrations to practical activities and role plays, all the way to case studies and simulations. Whatever it is that you're using, the idea is to make it more interesting and engaging for your learners, to make sure they are intrinsically motivated and that they engage with your content and your teaching, and that learning happens in a more fun and engaging way for longer term retention. Thank you for watching, and best of luck with your course.